Thank you for joining me today on the History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. I am your host, Steve. It is your lucky day today. I know not everyone could attend the big Intelligence Speech Conference 2019 in sunny New York City, but you didn't have to be there in order to enjoy at least one of the great presentations. Today I have the edited audio of my presentation with Garry Stevens of the History in the Bible podcast. The audio wasn't perfect, but we put it together as much as possible, especially with the questions. It was kind of a hectic scene inside of the conference hall, so I tried to repeat the questions as best as I could, but I think from context you can get a lot of what the questions are. Believe me, next time we will have a little bit better system for it. We've worked out some of the bugs, but it really went amazingly well on technologically, especially given some of Garry and my previous collaborations. This one, for all of the different moving pieces that went together, this one went incredibly. Now, unfortunately, Garry wasn't able to make it to the Big Apple, but he was able to join us via Skype, which was a cold pre-dawn morning for Garry to come all the way from Sydney, Australia. He also had his own technological and natural difficulties in Australia that we won't get into. But anyways, we based our talk around a true or false quiz. As you listen to the episode, you can play along at home on the quiz. Don't forget, the History of the Papacy now has certain episodes available on YouTube through our partner, the Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages, and we have some various pieces of merchandise such as t-shirts and sweatshirts available at a2zhistorypage.com/products. Now, before we go, I'd like to mention another exciting event coming up called TutorCon. TutorCon is coming to Pennsylvania in October of 2019. For 3 days, Tudor fans will meet in a newly restored winery on the grounds next to the Pennsylvania Renaissance Fair, just north of beautiful Lancaster, Pennsylvania. There's a particular restaurant I enjoy in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Anytime I get down into that country, I always go there. You will enjoy talks on everything from Tudor clothing to scandals, bookended by parties with period games and music, ending in a medieval feast with private entertainment in the feasting grounds of the Renaissance Fair. Tickets to the fair are included too. Tickets are limited to just 120 total, so the event will be small enough that everyone will really get to know each other and build friendships with other Tudor history enthusiasts from around the world. More information can be found at tutorcon.info. If you use the promo code POPE at checkout, you will get a $50 discount off your ticket. That is tutorcon.info and use the promo code POPE. I hope to talk to you soon about all these exciting developments in church and papal history and much more. Now enjoy our presentation, which was titled You Don't Know Anything About the Bible from the Intelligence Speech Conference 2019. So we're doing this little thing about the Bible. Garry, why don't you introduce yourself all the way from Sydney, Australia?
Sydney, Australia, where dawn is just breaking and is bloody freezing. My name's Garry Stevens, and I'm the producer, author, and editor of the History in the Bible podcast, where I take a look at the Bible from Genesis through to St. Paul and try and figure out what we can and cannot know about the history recorded in that book.
And I'm Steve, and I'm the host of the History of the Papacy podcast, and I do a podcast about the history of the popes of Rome and early Christianity. So today our big thing is we've come up with some things that are maybe true or false about the Bible, and I had no idea there'd be this many people here, so I didn't print out nearly enough of these, but maybe you can pass them around and share them with your partner. And we're going to try and make this as interactive as possible. In my day job, I'm an elementary school teacher, so I don't do lectures. But so we have some of our true and false statements here. Our first one that Gary's going to take is, the official Bible was set by the Roman Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea in 325 per Dan Brown. He said it, so it's got to be true. Who thinks that that one is true? Raise your hand. Who thinks it's false? Well, Gary, you have to tell us.
There is no official Bible. There never has been. Official for who? There's no more an official Bible than there is an official Christianity. Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox. Thanks to Martin Luther, Protestants have got 39 books in the Old Testament. The Catholics have got another 7. And the Orthodox include a whole slew of books that Protestants and Catholics have never heard about. 3rd and 4th Maccabees, 3rd Esdras, amongst others. And of course, there's the wonderful and wacky Ethiopian Orthodox. You may not be familiar with the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, but it's actually quite huge. There are more members of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church than there are Baptists in the United States. About 45 million of them. And they have another 6 books beyond the Protestants, Catholics and Orthodox in their canon. So that's just the Old Testament. The New Testament, thankfully, Protestants, Orthodox and Catholics have the same number of books. But of course, the Ethiopian Orthodox have to add another 6 books. Now, how did Christianity arrive at this collection? We have absolutely no idea. None at all. All we know is that around the year 367, the Patriarch of Alexandria wrote a letter, and it has a list of exactly our New Testament, just looking at the New Testament. How he got there, we don't know. And maybe it was just the Patriarch's idea of what should be in the New Testament. We do know that most early Christian writings have been lost, not copied. We know that there were dozens of other Gospels. There was the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Pilate, the Gospel of David, Philip, John. There are a whole bunch of books mentioned in early lists that were contenders but simply didn't make it. We've got things called the Letter of Barnabas, the Didache, the Shepherd of Hermas, the First Clement. For hundreds of years, there was a huge amount of disagreement as to what should be in the official Bible. And as we know in the modern canons, well, it still hasn't really been decided. So there is no official Bible.
All right, so question number 2. We know who wrote the books of the New Testament. It's right there in the title, Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Mark. Who thinks that is true, that the people who they say wrote it actually wrote it? True or false? All right, we got it. False. All right, what do you say, Gary?
Well, for a start, 9 of the 27 books of the New Testament are anonymous. They are not attributed to any author in the book. For example, all 4 Gospels are anonymous. Now, we know that the early church was using 4 Gospels pretty early on, but they're not named. They're just called the 4 Gospels or the 4 packets of good news, in effect. The first time that we find someone actually calling them by the names that we have is by a guy called Justin Martyr around the year 150. And it seems that the first person to really come up with names for all the things was a guy called Irenaeus, who was a bishop around about the year 200. And we don't know where he got the names from. The names for the Gospel of Mark, for example, is attributed to one John Mark, and he's mentioned a few times in the book of Acts as a companion to the disciple Peter. But nothing in the book of Acts gives us the slightest reason to think that this John Mark wrote the Gospel. He's just a handy name. And it's the same with all the other Gospels. People just seem to have attached them to names, and we don't know why or how they became attached. Now, the Gospel of John is a little bit different. It hints that its author is someone called the beloved disciple. Unfortunately, the Gospel of John doesn't mention the name of the beloved disciple. So that's another thing. Moving on from the Gospels, there are 4 works associated with the disciple John. The book of Revelation, but it just says it is by a John. Doesn't say it's by the disciple John. And there's a couple of letters, 3 letters associated with John. Now, one of them's not a letter for a start, and it is anonymous. And the others are just said by the elder. By and large, all the attributions we have for the books of the New Testament are tradition, and there's no concrete evidence behind any of them.
The third question is, the New Testament books were written soon after the death of Jesus. True? False? It's a qualified true. It depends on what you're saying soon after. Generally, by scholars, it's accepted that the books and the letters written by Paul were in the 50s AD. If we go with the early 30s AD CE, if you prefer, death of Jesus, then you're talking about 12 years after the death of Jesus. There is, in the letters of Paul, mention that there was somebody who existed in the early 30s AD named Jesus. Now, there's a reasonable assumption with at least three of the Gospels, that there was the Q source, which was a oral tradition that had gone back. The Gospels, traditionally, under the way the Christians, they said that Matthew was the first written, then Luke, then Mark, then John. Scholars have pieced together that since so much of Matthew and Luke rely on Mark, that Mark must have been the first one. Now, none of these books have an exact published date. You can't go to the title page and see published. But it's pretty much with Mark somewhere between 60 and 80 AD. 60 is the early end. 80, there's some outliers that would say much earlier, much later, but it's fairly safe in about that 20-year span. And then Luke came a little bit after that, within about a decade, and then John a decade or two later. Getting into the early 1st century BC, or CE rather, there's just an explosion of texts. Now, if you take in comparison other religious figures, like for Muhammad, the Hadiths aren't written for about 200 years after the historical Muhammad. So, given ancient writing, with Jesus, you're talking maybe about 20 years, and about 100 years before there's a full explosion of documents. The first non-Christian source would have been Josephus in the 90s, and then Tacitus in about the 120s. So like I said, about 100 years to get your first non-Christian mention of Jesus, and about a dozen years or so for the first Christian writing. Now, our fourth question would be, early Christianity spread quickly in part to their early adoption of a new technology. Now, we're always talking about new technology helping movements spread rapidly, so you think this one's true or false? And some people have the sheet there. Can you guess what the technology is? It was podcasting, you're right. It was the early, they were one of the, what we might call today one of the early adopters of the codex, which the codex is basically just regular book format. And before the codex, so I actually, like I said, I'm an elementary school teacher, so I can't help but making little visuals. And I made a codex based on the way that they would make a codex. They would take sheets of, in the earliest days, well, let me back up just a little bit. What did people use before you could open up a book? What do you think people used? And I actually did make an ancient scroll, too. And this is what they would have done. They didn't use rubber bands, but they would have had them tied together, and somewhere between 30 and 40 sheets of papyrus, which, if you know what papyrus is, it was basically a reed that almost exclusively grew in Egypt. They would split it, and then it would make convenient-sized leaves that were about that thick, and they would take a layer of them one way, lay them out, and then they'd take a layer this way, and they'd glue them together, and that would make roughly a sheet of paper. And it would actually make lines in the paper that you could write along. But now, try and use this. There's one obvious disadvantage of using them. You can only write on one side of it. If you write on the other side, it won't work that way, basically. Another problem, I mean, look at it, he can't even roll it up there. They become extremely heavy to use. So that's like the Library of Alexandria that people talk. These libraries didn't have a ton of volumes. They were really expensive. Some examples, and some ancient authors would talk about scrolls that were maybe 200 years old. But for the most part, scrolls didn't last that long because you're unrolling them, rolling them back up. The physical materials that they would use, like papyrus, it just didn't last that long. The text would scrape off. But around the time of Julius Caesar, they started using something called, they were actually calling them notebooks, and it was basically sheets of papyrus that would be just tied together with leather strips, and that was becoming and it was sort of a proto-codex form, fairly commonly known, the Vindelanum. It was an area in northern, right on the Hadrian's Wall, and for some reason, given like the soil conditions, the soft materials were preserved, and they found these pieces of wood, basically thin strips of wood that they would tie together, and people would write notes to each other. And they were not meant to last very long, but you could maybe put 2 or 3 of these together and basically send them as the mail. They also had wax tablets that people would use that it was basically a piece of wood that they poured wax into a frame, and people would use that as like a short note-taking device. But if you really put more than 2 or 3 of those together, it wasn't anything that was very portable. But then somebody had the bright idea, why don't we take papyrus and fold it together in a certain way? We cut the tops, and then you can bind those together and then write on them. Papyrus, though, it didn't hold up very well, and then it didn't last well in cold climates or humid climates. The glue that bound it together would just fall apart. So they started using parchment, which is basically leather, but it's thin. And when you bound those together into a book, you basically had the modern book. And the Christians really grabbed onto that format. They found a fragment of the Gospel of John that they can fairly accurately date to about 125 AD, and they know that it was in a codex format because it was written on both sides. So that's showing that fairly early, and given some other sources from Antiquity, like Martial, who was I believe he was a comedian in the Roman Empire and a satirist, he was he wrote about that they were using this newfangled invention of the codex in about the late 100s. So the Christians are starting to adopt that format at just about the same time that it's becoming popular. And you see that not much longer afterwards, they're starting to come up with harmonized gospels. Gary mentioned it a little bit. There's a lot of stuff in the gospels that are contradictory, or one part says a lot about one part and one part doesn't say it. One book might not say anything about it. And there were some Christians, especially in the Middle East, that would take all 4 of them and basically edit them down to one book. And so that was something. A scroll of the New Testament might be 4 or 5 scrolls, where a codex, you can carry one of them and bring that to Rome, bring that to here, bring that to there. And that helped the Christian movement spread really quickly throughout the Roman world and even beyond. So let's, that was a really long-winded answer, but let's go to the next one. Now, Gary, this one's one of your favorites. Jesus defined Christian family values. True or false? Well, let's get. The audience, true or false? True or false? You know, if you can see that, Gary got a... All right, what do you say, Gary?
Just before I get on to that, I'd like to mention something about the Codex. The Codex was also important for canon formation. If you have a set of sacred books and they're scrolls, you keep them in a big basket. And if one day you decide that you don't like this book anymore, you just tip it out of the basket. But if you start assembling a book, a collection of sacred books, and you bind them together as a codex, it's really hard to add or get rid of a book because the whole book is obviously defaced, or there's been something added to it. And, you know, making a codex in Roman times, a big proper one, was a fairly sophisticated thing and expensive. So the fact that you have all these books bound together instead of scrolls had an influence on what sort of book should be in the Bible. But anyway, on to family values. What I love to discover is when a tradition that we believe goes back for years turns out to be a recent invention. So let me take a look at those well-known expressions, Christian family values or traditional family values. Now, a lot of Christians would place these at the heart of their beliefs, along with faith in God and Jesus. Now, I used a wonderful tool called Google Ngram to track these expressions through time. No, it doesn't just start from the invention of Google. Google Ngram analyses millions of English language books going back to 1800. And you can just track phrases. Now, off the top of your head, when do you think that English speakers first started using phrases like Christian family values or traditional family values? Back in the 1600s, 1700s? Surely the 1800s. No, the 1970s. And as far as we can tell, the phrases were only invented at the earliest in the 1950s. So they're really very recent. Now, let's set aside that the entire concept is only 50, 60 years old. Did Jesus advocate traditional family values? Well, now here is Matthew's account of some of the words of Jesus. And I'll start with Matthew 8:21. Another of his students said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus said to him, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead." Jesus said, "For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." In general, you find throughout the Gospels, Jesus demands that his disciples reject their families. The followers of Jesus have no families. They only have Jesus. Now, let's take a look at probably the second most influential Christian who ever lived, Paul. Paul and family values. Paul rejects the whole idea of families. Now, here is Paul in the first letter to the Corinthians. Now, Paul is living in what he thinks is a very special time. He thinks Jesus is coming back any day now. Literally, any day now. He's living in a very narrow window before the end of the world. He doesn't care about families. We're all going to be gone soon when Jesus comes back. So Paul says, "Now concerning virgins, it is well for you to remain as you are. Are you a man bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you a man free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. Those who marry will experience distress in this life, and I would spare you that. The appointed time has grown short. From now on, let even those who have wives be as though they had none." Now, this is a cute one. "If anyone thinks that he is not behaving properly towards his fiancée, if his passions are strong, and so it has to be, let him marry as he wishes. But if someone stands firm in his resolve, being under no necessity, but having his own desire under control, he will do well to stay single." Paul basically says abolish families. He says don't get married, don't have sex. Be chaste, be celibate. I mean, Jesus is coming soon. What's the point?
All right, and then for our last one, for most of the history of Christianity, the Bible was usually read and interpreted as the literal Word of God. Ontologically and emphatically, everything in there was absolutely true. Anybody? Okay, we have one. Let's get some more commitment here. Come on, guys. Actually, that one is false. Really, it's for the most part, evangelicals, Christians in America in the 20th century are the ones who, like, if there's a parable, now parables in the in the Gospels are little teaching stories that Jesus told. And so there's one famous one about the mustard seed, and it's a little tiny thing that turns into a big tree. There is a certain strain of Christianity today that would say that mustard seeds have to be the tiniest seed ontologically, and they turn, like pound for pound, they turn into the tallest tree. Historically speaking, though, it's always been a balance between allegorical teachings and historical. Going way back into Antiquity, the first groups were really, there was a school based out of Antioch in Syria and then in Alexandria in Egypt. And if you've heard of Origen of Alexandria, he took most of the entire biblical canon as pure allegory, where, except for one very specific case where he took it very literally. But in other cases, like the Antiochian school, they were really trying to find what was the historical basis of this. So you had these two competing hermeneutical schools. And really, when you look into the modern day churches, they've all kind of taken a balanced approach to what's allegorical, what's historical. You might say it's even a cynical approach. The stuff that's really out there is allegorical. The stuff that's good is historical. I think we'll probably get the hook pretty soon. So why don't we take some questions if you have any? All right, so the question was, Gary, do you think Jesus was trying to find an entirely new religion, or found, rather, an entirely new religion?
No, I think there's no evidence for that at all. Jesus stands in a long tradition of Jewish apocalypticists who think that the world is going to end soon and God will soon put the people of Israel back into their rightful place. I think the whole concept of having a new religion just would never have occurred to Jesus.
So just for the audio, and so Gary to hear it, you're saying as once it was Christianity was adopted by as the official Roman religion, that the Bible was edited in such a way to fit the existing power structure. Maybe I'll take that one. What do you think, Gary? I'm going to say, kind of no, because most of the books that people were accepting as canonical were in place by that point. I don't think there's a lot of evidence to say that the text was edited in any way to fit the power structure. Then outside of the Roman Empire, a big part of Christianity that we don't really talk much about that went on in Persia didn't have any Roman power structure really, and they were against the existing power structure in Persia. There's actually an interesting case where the gospel or the Bible was tweaked a little bit, was when it was introduced to the Germanic groups outside of the Roman Empire. This could be apocryphal, but a couple of books of the Old Testament that they said was too militaristic were chopped out for the Goths. But besides that, the editing had more or less been done at that point by the 300s. It was really what books go in, what books go out. And it was more to fit what they thought was authentic to the time and authentic to their teachings. Would you add anything to that, Gary? Or
no, I just say all the evidence we have is that the latest New Testament book was written by 150. There could have been light editing thereafter, but from the internal coherence of all the New Testament books, they were clearly written and pretty much done and dusted well before Christianity was made the official religion. That's the scholarly consensus.
Could you tell us about the extra 6 Orthodox Ethiopian Gospels?
Now, they aren't actually Gospels. They are what we would call books of church order. That is, they are ways to run the church. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has the same number of Gospels, but it includes a lot of books, or some books, which people did note as candidates for the New Testament, but which never got into the New Testament. So, for example, the extra books in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church deal with how to run the church, how to hold the Eucharist, and that sort of stuff.
And we'll work our way out. They're not pulling the plug on us, so let's just keep going. In the Christian context or just in general? Garry, this is in your wheelhouse. How did the Old Testament develop as far as, that's a pretty big question, but in short, how did the Old Testament develop and evolve? What's maybe a couple of good facts about that?
Okay, well, basically, like in the New Testament, we don't know. The evidence seems to be that the first 5 books of the Tanakh were the earliest to be settled down, maybe around about 200, 300, no, actually earlier than that, 400 BCE. Then the books of the histories seem to have been gradually added, and the latest ones would be what we would call the wisdom and poetry literature. Because the Hebrew Tanakh is divided into 3 sections, and the last section, the Nevi'im, I think that's how it's pronounced, seems to be the latest. They must have been all locked down by round about 300 BCE, because around that time we have a Greek translation called the Septuagint written. But interestingly enough, the Septuagint has many books in it which the Jews later rejected for their canon. And this is one of the reasons why the Christian Old Testament has different numbers of books. Some, say the Catholics and Orthodox, tend to accept books which are found in the Septuagint, which the Jews themselves rejected, whereas the Protestants, following Martin Luther, don't.
Well, does the logic follow to say Jesus had this image himself when the rest of the argument says, well, we can't believe any of this garbage, okay?
I would, in Antiquity, the question really about what was allegorical versus what was historical, they're using literal in the term of what could be historical. For the most part, was really tapping into the Old Testament. Some of the more questionable parts, like when Samson, one of the popular ones where he kills like 3,000 people with the jaw of a, an ass or a donkey that he picked up off the ground. Things that seemed more fantastical, they had to try and find, how does that fit in exactly? Whereas the New Testament, I think they're trying to, for the most part, the allegory, that's where I think you get where they're trying to find the middle road of the Antiochian school or the literalist school, but more of the historical school versus the allegorical. They're trying to find the middle way between the two.
Yes, so...
That's a really interesting question. Nobody's really 100% sure what the earliest Christians did. There's sort of a debate, the house church debate, and they actually discovered a house church in a little place called Dura Europos that's right on the border of Syria and Iraq that was from about the 250s, and that's really the earliest purposeful church building that they've ever found. And it was a house that was converted into some sort of sacred space. At about the same time, in the same town, they found one of the earliest synagogues, which was something very similar. It was a residential area that was turned into a sacred space. It's not a house church like not everybody's coming to my house to hang out. It would almost be like this building if they dig it up 1,500 years from now. Well, it was a factory, but then we find these chairs here, and it was a meeting space. So it must have been a factory and a meeting space at the same time. They're pretty sure that this was the liturgical space and the church space was, once it was converted, it was set aside. And that's how Jewish practice was too, that it wasn't really a house church in the fact that it was somebody's home that was dual purpose, a home and a sacred space. Now, as far as using these sacred scriptures, again, we're not really sure how they were used, but they were probably used in some sort of liturgical sense, because there is examples of Second Temple Judaism where they were using texts and using things in a liturgical sense. Wow, these are tough questions. Woo. Ma'am, did you hear those questions, Gary? Okay, so why don't you take the first part and I'll take the second part. Would you say that there wouldn't be a church if it wasn't for Mary Magdalene, Mary of Magdala?
I think a lot of scholars would say that traditions associated with Mary Magdala were either suppressed or forgotten. So in a sense, we can never know. All we can say is that in the Gospels, Mary Magdala has a very crucial part to play in the Passion story. And in fact, she's the one who first encounters the risen Jesus. And she is the one who tells the other disciples. In the Gospels, Mary Magdalene is the apostle to the apostles. But that's it. That's a big moment. She disappears after the Gospels. She's not in the book of Acts. She's not in any of the letters. We don't know what happened. So the answer is we don't know.
And I love the second part. That's a great question. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and there's a bunch of other ones like the Gospel of Judas. Most of these were, I'm not exactly sure about the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, but the so-called apocryphal books, the books that are not in the canon, there was writings about them by what you call the early church fathers, or the early writers in the 200s and 300s and the 400s, of books that didn't quite make the canon. Some didn't quite make the canons, other ones like clearly got edited out. And those ones are called the apocryphal. They found a whole bunch of them that were actually written in codex format in a place in Egypt, the Nag Hammadi finds. And some people revered those books. We don't know exactly how they revered them. We just know that around that time there was a movement to get rid of those books. And there again, we don't know the exact motivations for getting rid of them. I don't see those. I mean, it's possible that those books, but a lot of those books were written and they're verified to be written way after the fact, like in the 250s and the 350s and the 400s. And a big part of why some of those books, and even there was things that people loved in them. There's one called the Proto-Evangelium of James, which a lot of the stories that are the most famous stories that we would know about early Christianity, you'll not find a single one of those stories in the 4 canonical Gospels, but they're in this book called the Proto-Evangelium of James that the early church people loved, but there was enough of it in there that we're going to pass on this one, but a lot of that became the oral tradition. I had heard a great YouTube person who's a divinity student. He said that a lot of these came out, they were basically Antiquity's version of fan fiction. The gospel doesn't fill in a lot of it's basically the skeleton, and like fan fiction, people want more. And there was people who were writing more to fill in those gaps. And like I said, the Proto-Evangelium of James had a lot of popular elements to it. Other ones had less popular elements to them. Nobody's saying, let's go. Gary, do you want to add to that?
Just about the Proto-Evangelium. That's one weird book.
It's short, too. Was written, you can read it in probably 20 minutes.
Yeah, be careful when reading it, though. I call it the Gospel of Creepy Jesus. It has Jesus killing little playmates whom he disagrees with. That's a very disconcerting thing to read.
And then does he bring them back to life or something?
No. Apparently Jesus is playing in the sand and he's making, you know how you build little dams and you pour in the water and you get rivers and that sort of thing? Well, this little kid comes along with his father and he breaks down Jesus' dams and the water runs away. So Jesus kills the father and the little kid.
And people like that because in the 4 canonical Gospels, there's Jesus is born. There's in one Gospel, one mention of him about 12. That's kind of like just a throwaway line, and then it's when he's in his 30s, and people want to see like what's going on in the early years. I think there is a counter-reaction there, and I mean a lot of the things that they say about the good things that are in the Bible and the teaching is does apply to the family, and I would say that there is something that goes through the New Testament narrative of Jesus is pretty close to his mom. He does have that spat in the middle, but I think that's kind of a narrative arc. Oh, we're getting the hook pulled on us now. In the middle, there is somewhat of a narrative of where they have a split, but I think that's kind of showing growth in Jesus as pushing back that he is a radical in a way at the time in the families. The family is pretty much as ultimate traditional as you can get, and you see that in the book of Acts and even in Josephus. So that pushback, I think, kind of shows a realism in a way. Gary, we're getting the hook pulled on us now,
Okay.
And people have to run, but I want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have another codex if somebody wants a memento. And there's a scroll on the floor there. Oh, you.
Could I just ask you?
Yeah, sure.
Are any of the non-canonical books?
So there's actually. Oh, thank you. Thank you. There's a couple of sites where you can read. They have most of them. There's one that's called Gnosis or Gnosis.org, and that has almost all of them.
Gnostic gospel?
Yeah, they have almost all of them. And then on Amazon, you can buy them oftentimes that they're bound and put in a more readable fashion, and you can get them, like, some of them are even free on Kindle.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Talking about the different groups of books
Thank
of
you.
the Bible. A book I read a few years ago was talking about the 3 branches of Eastern Christianity, like east of Orthodoxy. So
Yeah.
that would be the Ethiopians, the Syriac, and then just the Eastern, which made it all the way out to like India and China.
Oh, the Nestorians.
Is there any, surviving books of that?
Generally, they use almost the exact same books that were used by the Catholics and then the Eastern Orthodox. Is that pretty much accurate, Gary? As far as I know, the Syriacs, the Nestorians, and they all use pretty much the same canon as the Catholics are a little different. They had a couple of innovations here and there in the Middle Ages, but that the Eastern Orthodox use, at least. It's really the Ethiopians that have.
Yeah, I remember one of the points in the book was that when missionaries finally arrived in China, they found people saying, well, we actually are Christians, and no, that's not how that book goes.
The one thing that they did that was very common in the Middle East is those harmonized Gospels, where they would take all the 4 canonicals and put them into one. And Tatian was one of the ones who he did that harmonized gospel. That's probably what the book was saying, because it's a lot easier to carry from Antioch to China. This one volume, and those were very popular in the Middle East going east.
But those branches of Christianity were in constant contact.
Actually, the Nestorians, they were ones more in Persia, and by the time of really where Well, yeah, there, and a little bit earlier than that, when Rome had broken the Persian Wars, like in the 600s, they had really lost a lot of contact by then.
Okay, nice to have been there. I'll see you later. Okay, bye-bye.